Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to be here today to present during the Canadian National Invasive Species Awareness Week. So as Michaela said, I'm going to be presenting on implications of climate change for invasive species. But before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of what I'm presenting today is actually a collaborative effort from my colleagues at the University of Massachusetts, in particular, Dr. Bethany Bradley, and my colleague from the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is also based at UMass, Tony Lynn Morelli, and a collective effort of the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, which I'll introduce to you all later on in my talk. But before I really dive in, I also just wanted to give a little bit of background on where I'm coming from and what actually brought me to work on the topic of invasive species and climate change to begin with. The New York Invasive Species Research Institute is based at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and it was established to work at the with invasive species research and management. So to bridge the two worlds and to make sure that research is incorporated into management and policy decisions for invasive species. And we have a really interesting network here in New York with our boots on the ground partnerships for regional invasive species management that are out there doing the actual management, outreach and education and so on. But we also have a council and advisory committee, IMAP Invasives database, and all of our other agencies that are working with invasive species here in New York. And our role at the Research Institute is to listen to them and try to understand what their needs are so that we can make sure that research is being conducted to meet those needs. So invasive species and climate change really started becoming a topic that our stakeholders here in New York were bringing up a lot, asking us back in as early as 2015, how could we manage for invasive species in light of climate change? And around that same time in 2016 here in the US, President Obama released the amendment to the executive order on invasive species that really highlighted that the impacts of climate change should be incorporated into invasive species research and monitoring efforts. And so this, between our stakeholders asking us how could they manage for upcoming biological invasions in light of climate change, and the executive order, we really started kicking off this conversation here. Since then, some of the top scientists around the world working with invasive species have actually pointed out the importance of making invasion science and climate change a research priority. So today, for the purpose of today's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and mostly about its impacts on invasive species responses. Also, some additional recommendations to address these combined impacts. And then I really wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about the risk initiative and how we can increase knowledge and tools to incorporate climate change considerations into invasive species management decisions. So for starters, I'm not really going to go into depth on climate change. I know a lot of you have probably heard many climate change talks, read a lot about climate change in the news. But I did want to highlight some of the factors associated with climate change that are directly related to invasive species responses. First of all, we've all heard about rising CO2 levels. Although we need CO2 in our environment, its levels have risen far above 400 and are continuing to make our environment become warmer here. So here in the Northeast, and a lot of this focus of my talk is focused on the Northeast because that's been where our risk initiative has paid the most attention, had most of our stakeholders involved, but a lot of it is applicable everywhere. But here in the Northeast, I'm here in New York State, and we're seeing temperatures are on the rise, and we're expected to actually have a climate closer to the southern states or the mid-Atlantic to southern states in the next 50 years due to the average temperature rise. Our seasons are shifting, our springs are coming earlier, our winters are starting later. We're having milder winters as well. I'm sure up in Canada, you're seeing this, having the same experience. We have a lot more frost-free and growing days, especially in the Western US, but also here in the Northeast. We've seen earlier snow melt, less snowfall overall, which I'm so disappointed in because I love to ski. And our lake ice forms later and melts earlier. And so these are all really important things to highlight as we're thinking about invasives. In addition to the warming temperature and the shorter winters, we're also seeing increased frequency in temperature and precipitation extremes, as well as extreme weather events like hurricanes, flooding, as well as heat waves and droughts that are causing fires out west. So under these conditions, many invasive species are actually given a competitive edge. And so I'd like to shift over into some of those interactions. So first of all, we all know that plants need CO2 to grow, and they actually do better with increasing CO2. And if you look at this series of photos here under different CO2 levels, you can see that as the CO2 is increased, the tree is able to grow taller and faster. However, while all plants actually do a little bit better with more CO2, terrestrial invasive plants are actually able to take more advantage of this increased CO2 and grow even faster and taller. And so Cascade Sorte out in California did some work back in 2013 where she actually compared the response of native versus non-native plants to these rises in CO2 and actually showed that invasive plants do have a larger advantage. In addition, along with these warming temperatures, along with CO2, we have warming temperatures. And so the Arctic ice, we've heard about it melting, and it's actually opening up these new pathways for shipping and new ways that exotic invasive species can get introduced, particularly here onto the East Coast, but across the seaboard. Warming temperatures also cause an earlier green up of many species. So we're thinking about an earlier spring, we go out in the woods, we see that there's all these things greening up, but a lot of times those are actually the invasive species. And some work done back in 2011 showed that even though both native and invasive plants can bloom earlier and leaf out earlier, invasives actually, with being adaptive and plastic as they are, they're able to get a jump on it and green up sooner and actually take advantage of the resources and further block out the natives that would be normally coming into that same place. So it definitely gives them an advantage. And this isn't just happening in a terrestrial environment. We're also seeing warmer temperatures, water temperatures giving a competitive advantage to some invasives. Thinking about brook trout, which is one of our native species here in the Northeast that we really care about and that our anglers really love, and comparing that to introduced brown trout, under normal cooler water conditions, the native brook trout is able to compete for habitat and resources with the brown trout. But once we up the temperature levels a little bit, as we're seeing with climate change, brown trout actually have a competitive advantage and can outcompete the brook trout that we are seeking to maintain in our aquatic habitats here. And also the same goes for aquatic plant species. As we were talking about with with terrestrial plant species, we have Eurasian water milfoil was compared in a study to a native milfoil species. And the Eurasian water milfoil was able to extend its growing season, reproduce more prolifically, and later and grow later into the season. And so we see that they're taking advantage of the warming temperatures as much as the terrestrial species are. So not only are the species that are actually already present in a location doing better and being able to outcompete, we're also seeing that invasive plant species in particular, but also other taxa, are able to shift their ranges north. So as it becomes warmer in northern latitudes, we see kind of a march north of a lot of invasive plants and animal species. In fact, my colleagues Jenica Allen and Bethany Bradley back in 2016 did some projections to see which species were likely to move into new habitats, invasive plant species that were likely to move into new habitats with climate projections. And they showed that the Northeast and the upper Midwest, and I'm sure this extends north into Canada, but it wasn't included in their study, is actually going to be a hot spot for future plant invasions. And so, as I mentioned, that's not just true for plants. We're also seeing this happen a lot with other taxa like forest pests. Forest pests in particular are limited by the coldest night of the year, by the coldest temperatures of the year, by extended cold temperatures. And once we see these milder, warmer winters, they're actually able to march their way north into higher latitudes. And here in New York, for example, we had said that we would never see hemlock woolly adelgid in the Adirondack region, which is right here. It's this mountainous region in the center of the state. And a couple of years ago, it showed up. And so we're really seeing from, if we look back to 1997, this red is hemlock woolly adelgid range. And now as we're looking in 2020, we can see that there's a lot more and a lot farther north. This is also happening with other invasive pests. The southern pine beetle is actually a native pest, but was really present, as its name indicates, in the south of the US. And over the years, it's been moving farther and farther north. And back in 2014 and 15, it arrived here in the Northeast, arrived in Long Island, and we've been really trying to deal with it ever since here. And we are also seeing aquatic invasive species being able to survive and prosper farther north. Plant species like water hyacinth, Asian clams are able to adapt and shift their ranges as well. And I mentioned when I was talking about the change in winter temperatures and less ice cover, and we're also seeing changes in disturbance regimes that actually favor invasive species, like the ice scouring effect is important for removing didymo, or also called rock snot, from our streams and preventing its population growth, where when we have less ice and less ice scouring, we're actually seeing more of this species occur. And another issue that we need to keep in mind with warming temperatures is the ability for wildlife and human diseases to spread and have a greater impact than they did under cooler climates. Asian tiger mosquito is now surviving farther north and carrying along with it some of the diseases it carries, like dengue fever. Bats with white nose syndrome, as you are seeing here, it's been a problem in the Northeast. It's been a problem in colder climates, but it's become worse and been able to spread more rapidly and have a greater impact with warmer climates. So I should point out one thing though, this is not always a benefit. Warmer climates are not always a benefit for all species. And as you can see from Jenica Allen and Bethany Bradley's projections here, while we're seeing these great increases in the Northeast and Midwest, we are seeing a reduction potentially in some of these southern states. And for example, the formerly called gypsy moth caterpillar actually is reducing its range and moving farther north, retracting its southern range. And these projections are based on species that are already here. So that's not to say that new species won't fill in those openings that are coming up, but it's just something to consider as we're thinking about climate change. Now, I also mentioned an increase in stream events as one of the characteristics that could help invasive species along. So hurricanes do a great job of opening up tree canopy and providing disturbances. And this study that was done before and after Hurricane Katrina hit showed that as the tree canopy cover was reduced from the openings produced by the impacts of Katrina, there was a significant increase in invasive blackberry that really took over the understory. And as you can see from pre and post, the impacts of invasive understory species is really great in this situation. We're also seeing that the warmer climate plus drought can actually stress out trees more and make pests more abundant. This was a really cool study that was done by Steve Frank down at North Carolina State University, and his graduate student at the time, Adam Dale, who's now at University of Florida. They were looking at gloomy scale, which is a native pest here in the US, and it impacts red maples. But what they did was they set up used cities as as a simulation of climate change, because cities tend to be like a couple of degrees warmer than outside of the city. So they set up an experiment where they prevented the city trees from getting sufficient water. And then they introduced the gloomy scale, or they worked with trees. I don't remember if they worked with trees that already had gloomy scale, but then they compared that to trees outside the city that were a couple of degrees cooler and had sufficient water. And what they found was really interesting, that on these drought stressed trees that were in the warmer climate, the pests were significantly more successful and had a higher impact on the trees. So this just shows us that as cities and natural habitats become hotter and drier, damaging pests will actually become more abundant. Another consideration that we've been thinking about and been seeing examples of more and more is that unknown future invaders that we are calling sleeper species are starting to become more concerning and more problematic. And as you know, we have a lot of non-native species that are present and they're just naturalized into our environment here, but they're not really overpopulating. They're not outcompeted natives. They're just kind of these benign bystanders within our habitats here. But a lot of times these species are actually limited by climate. So as the climate might become more favorable, warms up a little bit, those species are actually released from these climate restrictions and are then able to become problematic invasives. And there are a classic example of that is the acorn barnacle. And this example comes from the UK coast, where the species was present for 50 years. And then after a series of mild winters, its populations exploded and it became a problematic invasive species. And we have some species here in the Northeast that could become problematic that we're keeping an eye out from. And you'll see more work coming out on this in the near future as people are really starting to look at which of these species are likely to become problematic under changing climate. Another consideration that as the climate changes could become more challenging for us is that some control methods actually become less effective under climate change conditions. This study by Lou Ziska back in 2004 compared the efficacy of the herbicide glyphosate to control Canada thistle, which is an invasive plant species. And he compared control, which you see on the left, under normal CO2 conditions. And then he did the same control efforts under future CO2 conditions with the same number of species. And you can see that under higher CO2, as I mentioned earlier, plants are able to grow stronger and taller and more robust, and glyphosate was actually less effective in his study. Some of our other control efforts, such as biological control, may also be impacted by climate change. And this is kind of a growing area of research right now. And I think we're going to have a lot of interesting work to read about in the coming years as people are exploring these interactions. But biocontrol being the introduction of a native pest species, species from the native range of one of our target species, actually could become less effective due to climate change because they're supposed to be matched to their target species. So if we decouple the phenology of the biological control agent as target, it could make it less effective, or a change in growth and reproductive rate of both the agent and the target, or even the change in range that might happen as a species changes its range, and maybe the biocontrol isn't able to do that together with it. So we will keep you updated on this moving forward, but I think there's a lot of interesting information that we'll be finding in the years to come. So I've talked a lot about how climate change actually impacts invasive species, but what we haven't really thought as much about, and we're hearing more about in recent years, is that invasive species can also have an influence on climate change. And so by reducing forest cover, as we're seeing with some of our extensive and high impact forest pests, we're actually reducing the carbon sequestration potential of these forests. And a really great study, there's been a number of studies over the past few years, but one that just came out last year led by Brendan Quirion here at Cornell, together with a number of colleagues, including those from the Nature Conservancy, actually found that he was actually trying to quantify how these insect and disease disturbances could reduce carbon sequestration in forests in the US. And this study is going to be presented tomorrow. We're doing a webinar for the US National Invasive Species Awareness Week. And I'll be a part of it, but I won't be talking quite as much. And my colleague, Brendan, and some of his co-authors will be presenting on that study. So tune in and check that out if you're interested in getting more details. Another area that we need to be thinking about, which isn't as big of a deal here in the Northeast because we don't have the same number of forest fires, is that of the interaction between invasive grasses and fire occurrence and frequency intensity across the US and across Canada as well. This was a neat study by Emily Fusco, who's also going to be presenting in this webinar tomorrow, where her and her colleagues looked at 12 species, analyzed 12 invasive grass species, and they found that 8 of them showed an increase in fire occurrence up to 230% and an increase in fire frequency up to 150%. Finally, before I wrap up some of these interactions of invasives and climate, one issue that has continually been raised, and I think it's something we're going to have to all think about, is we're considering invasive species management and impacts to native species moving forward, is the idea that some native species may actually become problematic and more of a invasive, acting like bully under changing climate. And we've been calling these nuisance neonatives. They're actually native range shifting species that have established themselves beyond their historical range and started demonstrating qualities and damaging impacts similar to that of an invasive species. And so here we have black locust as an example, but there's a number more that we can think about, including southern pine beetle, which I mentioned earlier. So in wrapping up this portion of my talk, climate change provides opportunities for invasive species such as increased growth and density due to higher CO2, hardier invasives under CO2 showing resistance to herbicide, potential reduced effectiveness of biocontrols, earlier green up, therefore priority effects for invasives and other competitive advantages, northward shifts of invasives due to warmer temperature and milder winters, increased new establishment due to increased disturbance from extreme events, waking up sleeper invasive species, carbon storage opportunities lost to invasive pests, facilitating the spread of both wildlife and human diseases, and these neonatives, native species becoming a nuisance. And this illustration here comes from some work from the Risk Network that you can access this document and this illustration online. I just like to show this because it's a nice way of demonstrating some of these impacts in one nice picture. So we've also started thinking about some of the ways that and recommendations to address these combined impacts of invasive species and climate change. So first of all, one thing would be strategic planning, thinking ahead. We can identify and prioritize areas that we think are going to be vulnerable to some of these northward shifting invasive species. And then we can plan for invasive species detection and management after extreme events, since we know the disturbance is likely going to open up the opportunity for new invasions. And we can include invasive species considerations into climate change adaptation plans. We can also think of solutions in terms of preventive management. We can plant climate resilient native species. We can avoid planting non-native species that could actually be sleeper species moving forward. We can create watch lists and keep an eye out for range shifting invasive species. We know that some of these are going to be moving north, and so we can keep an eye and try to keep them out before they get established. Also, we can think about our treatment and control efforts in terms of climate change. Obviously, we know these species, the invasives are coming in sooner, so we may need to adapt our treatments and controls to the new growing seasons. And incorporate the idea that some of these species might be increasingly resistant and come up with diverse treatment methods for invasive species. And we can conduct rapid response efforts when range shifting species are detected. In terms of education and outreach, it's really important for all of us to keep up to date on new information and tools to incorporate climate change into invasive species management. And I'll provide some opportunities for that in the last bit of my talk here. And also, the fact is, like, we all have different knowledge. We've been here in New York learning from some of our southern neighbors. And we can also, you know, as we're looking north and we know some of our species are moving up north, we can also share that knowledge and educate our fellow colleagues on response and control methods. Finally, in terms of policy, we can develop policies that consider climate change impacts on invasives. We've been actually starting to do that and really go through some policies to see how we can incorporate the things we do know about invasives and climate change into those policies. We can be proactive. If we know some species are likely to move in, maybe we can regulate them and prohibit them before they get here. We can streamline the process to include new species and regulations. And we can also include invasive species issues in climate change policy and planning. So finally, for the last couple of minutes of my talk here, I'd like to talk a little more about how we can increase knowledge and tools to incorporate climate change considerations into invasive species management decisions. So I mentioned that President Obama put forth the executive order, the amendment to the executive order on invasive species back in 2016. In addition to saying that we should include climate change, he also really emphasized the need for innovative science and technology to address these issues. And here in the US, we had a big push from the National Invasive Species Council at the time that through technology and innovation, we can do this. We can actually deal with this problem a lot better. And I talked a little bit about how the research institute that I work for really seeks to bring together managers and researchers. And this isn't really a new idea. It's really been talked about for hundreds of years, where even Woodrow Wilson 100 years ago said, the man who has the time, the discrimination, the sagacity to collect and comprehend the principal facts, and the man who must act upon them must draw near to one another and feel they are engaged in a common enterprise. So we've seen so much more invasive species research than ever before. The number of publications continues to climb. Yet we're still seeing that there's a gap between invasive species management decisions and invasive species research. And Virginia Mastag back in 2014 said that there's a gap between research and management, so that scientific information accumulates, but it's not incorporated into management actions. And she called this a knowing doing gap. She also went on to try to figure out why there was a knowing doing gap. Why weren't decision makers incorporating science into their decisions? And what she found is that most of the people were getting their information, the managers, from informal conversations and learning from their own experiments. Some from synthesized information, also from conference and symposium and webinar attendance. But peer-reviewed journals were actually, if this was to scale, this would be way off my screen. And so publishing science in scientific journals isn't always going to mean that it actually gets into the hands of the people who are going to use it. And not only that, it's not only where it's located, but sometimes the information that's being produced by science doesn't actually address a specific question. So Virginia Mastag actually in 2015 went on to compare what kinds of research was being produced and what kinds of research managers actually needed. And she found that there was a mismatch between stakeholder needs and researchers' output. So this is where the field of translational invasion ecology comes in. We published a paper with my colleague, Tony Lynn Morelli, who led us up on this effort back in 2021, talking about this approach where intentional inclusive process in which researchers, stakeholders, and decision makers collaborate to develop and implement research via joint consideration of the sociological, ecological, economic, and political context of the problem of invasive species. In this paper, we actually identify a path or a process that we've seen be successful and a way to engage stakeholders and make sure that we're actually incorporating these needs into our research agendas. So I mentioned at the beginning that part of what drove me to get involved in this field was that the managers and the stakeholders here in New York State that my institute serves were asking for more information on how to incorporate climate change into invasive species decisions. And with that, I got together with my colleagues, Bethany Bradley and Tony Lamorelli, we founded the New Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network, and with the objective to address this question that kept coming up and really didn't have a good answer for. So a mission has been established over the years, and that we really are aiming to reduce the compounding effects of invasive species by synthesizing science, communicating the needs of managers to researchers, building these stronger scientist-manager communities, and conducting priority research. And over the past 5.5 years, this network has grown to over 600 members here in the Northeast and beyond. And we have a great leadership team that's always growing as well. But shortly after we became established, one of the most important steps that we did is we went out, and this work was led by Eve Bowery, who was a PhD student in Bethany Bradley's lab at the time, to try to do this survey and understand what people really needed to know in order to incorporate climate change into invasive species management. And what she found out, of course, as we might expect, is that lack of information was a barrier to including climate change into management actions. And so in response to that, our group for the past 5 years has been producing research summaries. So we find research articles in the literature and we summarize them boil it down into a short couple of paragraphs so people can really understand what kind of new research is being done in the area. We also synthesize on topics like, for example, sleeper species or impacts in warming waters, implications for invasive species. We synthesize these into 1 to 2 page papers that then people can use to help better understand the interactions. And we're not only just taking from science, but we really want to learn from people who are dealing with this out in the field or in the policy realm. And so we have a management challenge that we call Taking Action. And those are some of the recommendations I presented right before I got into the risk part, is that we actually surveyed managers and policymakers and asked what actions they were taking. And then we summarized these so that they could be shared, because there's so much knowledge that we all have that doesn't always get published. So we were also looking at where they were getting information similar to MASTEC's work, and found that, like MASTEC, one-on-one conversations with experts and colleagues was the #1 source of information. But we also found that symposium workshop was the second one. So since then, we've been coordinating an annual conference as well as workshops. We wanted to know what topics they were considering and interested in. And so things like resilient native communities came out #1, but range shifting species and hotspots and understanding those was the second highest priority that managers identified. So just to give you a quick example of how we've actually worked with managers to take research and translate it to action through the risk network, as we know, the plants and animals are shifting north, so we know that they're coming in to new environments. They're responding by shifting their ranges. And even though range shifting invasives are a concern, they're also an opportunity, because we can start working down at this end of the invasion curve and prevent them from being introduced before they get introduced if we know they're coming. And so I showed a map of the collective projections for invasive plant species and where they're likely to move. But Jenica Allen also did individual species and went in and looked at and did projections for individual invasive plant species to see which ones are likely to move where based on climate projections. And so using these range shift projections for many species, we can create watch lists and regulate these species ahead of time. So she actually went on to work with EdMaps in the Northeast IPM Center to produce a range shift listing tool. So you can actually go in and figure out which plant species are likely to move in to your county based on climate change projections. And so you can get a watch list such as this one. So although these watch lists are great, and we did this for New York State, and so there was 100 species that came up as likely to move into New York State. some of Bethany Bradley's students actually went in and then we took these species and we ran them through our invasive species ranking form. This is a necessary step for us to actually put these species on a prohibited or regulated plant list, which can then prevent them from getting into the state and starting to be used in horticulture and landscaping. You know, we can take care of that before it actually happens, because a lot of the species we had on this list previously were species that were already widespread here in the state, so we weren't going to really be able to do anything about it. And so this was a new approach, a proactive approach. And this actually has been published. We do have a management challenge talking about this whole process, so you can definitely check it out on the Risk Network website. And, you know, this is actually not just New York that wasn't being proactive. It's actually kind of a common problem that we're being reactive to invasive plant species and not being proactive to list things and regulate them ahead of time. We also haven't been communicating enough with our neighbors because we only have about 30% overlap of regulated plant species here in the Northeast with our neighboring states. So we've been working with our regional invasive species councils throughout the New England and New York area to try to get on the same page, share our assessments, and proactively start listing these species. So I'll wrap up here because I know I'm getting late in my talk, but I did just want to say that, you know, climate change definitely creates these new risks from invasive species, but it does also create the opportunity for us to work together, to share knowledge, and to start thinking about how we can prevent future invasions and learn how to reduce some of these combined impacts of climate change and invasive species. And, you know, I keep talking about Northeast examples because that's where I've been working, but actually, this is a nationwide and a continental issue. And we've been seeing here in the US since the Northeast risk was established 6 years ago, we've had a North Central risk established, a Pacific Islands risk, a Northwest risk, and also now the Southeast risk is in progress of being established. And so this is really exciting. And we've been working together as a cross-risk, cross-continent group. And we invite all of you guys to get involved. It's not really limited by borders, and we'd love to share our experiences and work with all of you in Canada as well. So with that, I'll wrap up and I can use my last few minutes to address any questions that have come up.